Hello and welcome to the presentation on the 4 levels of explanation, Redux. We've already had this lecture topic in this class at the very beginning, but it's such an important concept to grasp that I really wanted to have a review and a deeper explanation of these different perspectives we can use to explain behavior. And that's been the whole question of the class. How can we explain behavior? In particular, how can we explain human behavior as different from other primates and other animals? So if you remember, there are 4 levels of explanation. We talked about proximate levels. These are explanations due to immediate causation and mechanism. We talked about ontogeny as being developmental explanation. We talked about ultimate being a functional or adaptive or evolutionary explanation. We talked about phylogeny as an explanation, and I'm going to go through each of these in more detail for your review one more time. But if you remember, we talked about these being divided up into 2 groups. The first 2 are how questions. How does this behavior happen? So if you remember the example of the warbler on the deck, and how does the warbler know when to migrate south for winter? Well, the how question is the sunlight's changing, the wind patterns are changing, the bird is at a certain point in its life cycle, and when the forces align, then the bird knows that it's time to migrate. And so it's a how, these are how explanations of how the behavior is triggered to happen. The other 2 are why questions. Why does this behavior happen? So an ultimate, a functional explanation would be, why does this bird migrate south for winter? And it might be because there's not enough food in the area and the bird will starve if it stays where it is. So it increases this bird's survival and reproductive success. Phylogeny says this bird migrates because its ancestors migrated, and it's part of the species history that has made the species successful in the past and made its ancestors successful. Don't worry too much about phylogeny. It's really the most complicated level. We'll talk about it a little bit. But if you want to know more, take an upper division class. So mostly in this class we've focused on ultimate level explanations because it is so interesting to ask these why questions and figure out how we answer them. But today I thought we would cover all of the levels and pick one particular behavior and look at it from these multiple perspectives. So let's start off with proximate and ontogeny. These are the operation of current mechanisms, and we group these together because they're the how questions. So let's ask, why is this person crying? And we're going to start by looking at how does crying get triggered, basically. So a proximate level looks at the immediate causes, and you can think about breaking these down into 2 groups. You can think about internal causes like your physiology, your hormones, your biology. I'm sure you're aware that you're more likely to cry when you've had less sleep, or perhaps you have increased levels of particular hormones, or there's something in your eye. So these are immediate causes that would trigger a tear response. There's also external causes like environmental triggers. So why is this person crying in the picture? Well, maybe it was scared, a predator came by. That would be an external cause. An internal cause might be, well, this person is hungry, and that's why she's crying. So those are proximate immediate causes. Ontogeny looks at changes through the life cycle. So when we ask, why is this person crying, you might say, well, this person is crying because he's a baby. But if you imagine this baby going through his whole life, adults and children cry quite differently and for quite different reasons. Children generally cry when they're hurt or hungry or feel alone, much more physical responses. Adults generally cry for much more emotional reasons. It's a more emotional crying than children cry for. So when you look at this behavior across the life cycle, you can see how it changes depending on age. And so this is the ontogenetic explanation. Why is this person crying? Well, it will depend on how old they are. And so there's kind of, again, 2 ways we can break this down. We can look at internal changes, so things like hormonal exposure, brain development, for example, changes in the physiology. And we can also look at external reasons, and this includes observational learning, which is culture. So as humans age, we learn things, we gain culture, we gain behaviors that we've observed in other people, and that will affect how we perform certain behaviors. So there's very cultural ways to cry in different societies that we actually acquire over the course of our life cycle. And because we are such cultural beings, that this is actually a main cause of explanation for behavior in humans. So let's look at the evolutionary explanations, and these involve the why questions, and the answer we'll look for an explanation that would increase the fitness value of the behavior. So remember, fitness is a measure of survival and reproductive success, and it's all about being fit to your environment. So if an environment where crying increases your survival and reproductive success, it increases your fitness and it increases your adaptiveness to that environment. And it's interesting to think about crying with evolutionary explanations, because humans are the only primate that cries outside of having some sort of foreign object in the eye. We're the only humans with emotive crying as adults and tears as children. And so we can use a phylogenetic explanation sometimes to look at behaviors, and these would be characteristics inherited from our ancestors. And if you don't know, the definition of phylogeny is an organization of species by ancestral relationships. So you can see here a phylogeny of the primate order. There's humans and other apes on the right. We share a ancestor with Old World monkeys. Both of us, the humans and apes and Old World monkeys, share an ancestor with New World monkeys, and back and back and back. And so you could think of Old World monkeys being our cousins, New World monkeys being our second cousins, tarsiers being our third cousins, etc., etc. So the farther back you go with an ancestor, the more distant the relationship. Now, young primates and primate infants do make alarm noises when left alone or when threatened, and they make a crying face, but there's no tears like humans. So interestingly, when we talk about crying, we can't use a phylogenetic explanation because we're the only primates to do so. Now, if we were to look more closely at our family tree, if we were to zoom in on the humans and other apes, it might be interesting to think about how far back crying goes. Do we share it with Homo erectus, for example? Or do we have to go back to the Australopithecines, these ancestors that we have between ourselves and other apes? However, they're all extinct, so we'll probably never know. So a phylogenetic explanation in this case doesn't help us much. But that's okay, sometimes it doesn't. That allows us to look more closely at this ultimate level of explanation, and this is the explanation that looks at the adaptive value of the behavior. Does it increase survival and reproductive success? So we can look at impacts on both of these. So impacts on survival could be things like getting fed as an infant. Infants that cry more get more attention, and generally the more attention you have, the more likely you would be to survive. Impacts on reproduction might occur later in life, but if you think about when people cry as adults, one time when they cry is when they've done something to disturb their cooperative relationships. They've done something that's hurt a friend or a romantic partner, and so people cry as an honest signal of this feeling of guilt and remorse and the fact that they have a genuine interest in the relationship and want to maintain it. So, and cooperative relationships, as we know from all our reading, have a huge effect on human reproductive success. So sometimes from an ultimate perspective, we can use one thing to talk about survival and reproduction. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. But remember, in order to get your genes to the next generation, you have to both survive and reproduce, so you have to consider both of these. Okay, we're going to have a little mini pop quiz now. So think about this question and feel free to pause the video. What I'd like you to do is to see if you can come up with an explanation for why some langurs commit infanticide, and see if you can come up with an explanation from each of the 4 levels. Okay, I'm going to put up some of the explanations that I came up with. They might not be the same as yours. There are many, many different explanations, but just to give you some examples of how you might answer this question from the 4 levels. So approximate explanations might be emotions or hormones. We know in humans that infanticide is much more likely to happen with women suffering from postpartum depression. So hormonal fluctuations after giving birth might cause some primates to be more infanticidal, and this would apply to mothers. Some primates, males, will commit infanticide when they come into a new group, so they might have a hormonal surge that encourages infanticidal behavior. Ontogeny. This is what I came up with. Perhaps you're a new male in the group. So you think about a male langer across his whole lifespan from infancy to old age. The time in their lifespan they are most likely to commit infanticide is when they're a young male coming into a group for the first time. Why? Well, we'll talk about the why later, right? This is just how. Ontogeny also might include new moms. So new moms among primates are notoriously bad. They just don't have a lot of practice, and they're very poor at handling their infant. And most firstborn infants, two primate mothers die due to the mom's poor mothering skills because she hasn't had any practice. So perhaps she's just unlearned and inexperienced at this. We can look at phylogeny. Pretty much all species of langurs are infanticidal, as are many species of old world monkeys. So we can just look at this as a trait, a characteristic of old world monkeys and of langurs in particular, that they've inherited from other ancestral species. The why question. See, these are just the most interesting. One we can look at is a current versus future trade-off for moms. We discussed infanticide in our lecture on trade-offs in life history. If mom is seeing a really bad year coming up, she has a dependent infant, it's going to basically kill her to care for that infant, she might decide that it's not worth the cost currently, and she'll forego reproduction right now to bet on a better chance in the future. So that would be an answer to the why question. Or, if we want to talk about males coming into groups for the first time, why do they experience these surge in hormones that it causes them to be more infanticidal, and why when they come into the new group? And it could be because access to reproductive females is very important for would-be dads. You're only going to have a few seasons as the alpha male in the group. You're only going to have a few seasons to reproduce. You want to encourage the females to become reproductively receptive as soon as possible, and that means you kill their current infants so they can become receptive to a new pregnancy with your offspring instead of the previous males. I also thought we could do this question, because this is a very pertinent question to many people in our society. Why do so many people struggle with obesity? So you can go ahead and pause, and then I'll give you some explanations that I came up with on the next slide. So this is what I came up with, just a few of them. Some approximate explanations. Well, fats and sugars taste good. The immediate cause is that they just are very appealing to us. We have cravings for them, and they have a lot of positive receptors in the brains when we eat fats and sugars, and these are very calorically dense food. If we look across the life cycle, we can see how weight is put on differently at different ages: toddlerhood, childhood, teenagers, adults, old age. There's different rates of obesity, and there's different susceptibility to obesity at different ages. Phylogeny, we can look back through the primate order and look at this ability to gain weight and store fat. And we also might question, why do we need to see a weight gain? Why do humans have the ability to be obese? And the adaptive explanation might be, well, there's a lot of feasts and famine times in many environments. So gaining weight when there's a lot of resources available might sustain you through leaner times, dry seasons, less fruit and other foods available. Also, weight gain can help you sustain pregnancies. So the big question here is, which one is the real one? Are these explanations mutually exclusive? And ultimately the answer is no. All of these can be more or less important. All of them can be equally important. You might have one or more that's not such an important explanation, like we talked about phylogeny and crying. But we'll discuss this more in the next presentation on looking at multiple comparative perspectives and how do we weigh these and how do we use them in life. So thanks for listening.